Hello again, everybody. This is Steve Kallas, speaking of sports, and we're here to talk a little bit about the 1980 stunning upset, greatest upset in the history of sports, in my opinion, of the United States over the Russian Olympic team. Again, in the semifinals of the Olympics, nobody remembers they had to beat Finland 2 days later to win the gold. That was almost anticlimactic. But I want to take you back a couple of weeks before the Olympics and then talk about the actual game itself, because I think there's been a lot of coverage, of course, 40-year anniversary and everything like that, but I think a lot of stuff gets lost in the shuffle because people forget things that happened a couple of weeks before the Olympics, and even in that game, Mike Eruzione scored the winning goal, and every time that's all you see, and do you believe in miracles? Yes, and that's all great. But there are just a few other things. The first thing I want to talk about is a couple weeks before the Olympics started, the U.S. played the Russian Olympic team, the team they would eventually beat, in Madison Square Garden. You know, couldn't have a better spot to play. Way back then, my father and then my mother had season tickets to the Rangers, and so we were able to get tickets to go see this game. Now, I can't tell you it was wildly popular or anything like that. I can't even say it was a big deal. In fact, the crowd was estimated at like 12,000. And it wasn't sold out, that's for sure. But in any event, the final score of that game was Russia 10, the US 3. And I was at that game, and I can tell you sometimes they say 10-3 was the final score, and it wasn't even that close. Well, it wasn't even that close. It was 4-0 after one. Jim Craig, who would become the super goalie in the playoffs in the Olympics, who beat the Russians, he gave up 5 goals in a game and a half. And I forget the sub's name, but he gave up 5 goals in a game and a half. And it was a sound crushing. And after the game, Tikhonov, the coach, Viktor Tikhonov, who we will talk about later, he was like so overly confident, we're much better than them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I just want to read one quote after that game from Herb Brooks, the legendary coach of the U.S. Olympic hockey team, who again would eventually win the gold medal after beating the Russians in the semifinal game. Here's what Herb Brooks said after that game, literally 2 weeks before the Olympics. Quote, "Anyway, I'm not worried about the Russians. I'm worried about the Czechs and the Swedes, the teams we got a chance to beat, the teams we have to beat. I don't mean to sound defeatist, but you've got to combine idealism with pragmatism, and practically speaking, we don't have a chance to beat the Russians." That's Herb Brooks 2 weeks before the Olympics. I don't think that was some kind of incredible psychological thing, although some people have tried to paint it as such. I think he saw what he saw, and he was a seasoned coach, and they were going to get their heads kicked in if they ever played the Russians. Of course, that's not what happened. So I want to flash forward to the game now. And I want to talk about the real MVP of the game. Some people say it's Mike Eruzione. He scored the greatest goal in the history of hockey. Maybe he did. Jim Craig, the goaltender, who gave up those 5 goals in 30 minutes at the Garden, but then held the Russians to 3 goals in the biggest game of his life. But the real MVP of that game was Mark Johnson, and people forget all about Mark Johnson. The first thing he did was he scored a goal with 1 second left in the first period to tie the game at 2. They were already losing. The U.S. was losing. The U.S. never led in the game until Eruzione scored in the middle of the third period. But Johnson scored a goal with 1 second left, and that led Viktor Tikhonov, the coach, to pull Tretiak, the goalie. Tretiak was one of the greatest goalies in the world at the time. He might have been the greatest goalie in the world at the time. And Russia, never lost. So he pulled him after 1 period, which was viewed to be a panic move at the time. And the backup Mishkin was a good goalie, but he was no Tretiak, who again, if he wasn't the greatest goalie in the world, he was one of the 5 greatest goalies in the world, and that includes all the NHL guys. So Mark Johnson, by scoring that goal, led to the Russian coach pulling the top goalie on the planet. And that, of course, helped lead to the victory. So not only did Johnson score that goal, when they were down 3-2 in the third period, about 8 minutes and 39 seconds into the third period, he scored again. So Mark Johnson scored 2 goals in that game, and nobody remembers who he is. So I just thought it was incredible. To me, he's the MVP of the game by far. Craig played great, Eruzione scored the goal, but Mark Johnson, first with the goal that had them pull the goalie, and then Mark Johnson in the third period ties the game, and then it was only 1 minute and 21 seconds later when Eruzione scored the game winner. A few other things about that game. after Eruzione scored like a minute later, Maltsev, who was another star in the Russian team who had already scored a goal, hit the post. Nobody remembers. You know, you hit the post, you've missed a goal by what, an inch, maybe two? So it wasn't that the Russians weren't trying, it was that the U.S. Could hold them off and did hold them off. In the longest 10 minutes of a hockey game I've ever seen, felt like an hour and a half. But they did hold them off and win the game. A few other stories. So there was a guy, I want to give you his exact name because you might know who he is, Slava Fetisov. He eventually played in the NHL, and he was teammates with Mark Johnson on the Devils. And Mark Johnson actually went up to him years later when they were on the Devils and said, so what was that? What happened with pulling the goalie? Why did you pull Tretiak? He was such a good goalie. And Mark Johnson said the only thing that Fetisov told him was, quote, crazy coach, close quote. I mean, that's great stuff. Even the Russians thought the guy was out of his mind. Fetisov, as you probably know, you diehard hockey fans, he was on the Devils, but then he went to the Red Wings, won back-to-back cups. He's in the Hall of Fame. So, I mean, that's the quality of guys. The U.S. had a bunch of guys who played in the NHL, but no Hall of Famers, no superstars. Again, it just shows you the magnitude of the upset, coupled with the fact that they had gotten their heads kicked in a couple of weeks earlier. A few other things. At the end of the game, and you know how this is, it's been like this for 50 years or more, the Russians didn't pull the goalie. So Mishkin was in goal, the backup goalie. They were down by 1 goal. Normally you'd pull the goalie a minute left, 2 minutes left. Nowadays in the NHL, they pull the goalie with 3 minutes left or 4 minutes left. But Tikhonov, the coach, who made the huge mistake by taking out Tretiak, didn't pull the goalie. And when asked years later, they asked a couple of guys on the team, and they said, yeah, we never pulled the goalie. We never played 6-on-5. We never got the man advantage that way. Tikhonov just didn't believe in it. So if you had a guy, even in 1980, who didn't believe in pulling the goalie, again, it had been done years and years before by Frank Boucher, the coach of the New York Rangers. He was the first to do that. It's just inexplicable. So there were so many mistakes on the other side, as often happens when you have a monumental upset like this. The other guys have to help you a little bit. And certainly Tikhonov, unwittingly, helped the U.S. by first pulling the goalie, pulling Tretiak, the star goalie, and then at the end of the game, not pulling the goalie out for an extra skater. So I don't understand how that all happened. It was shocking at the time until you spoke to the Russians and they all said, nah, we never did that. So just to recap, it was the greatest upset ever. The only thing I would compare to it personally is Buster Douglas when he was knocked down by Mike Tyson and then got up off the canvas and beat Mike Tyson. I don't think that's nearly as great as this because, again, the Russians were the premier team in the world. These were all college kids, no NHL players. It's not like later years. No NHL players played in the Olympics. So this was an unbelievable job by Herb Brooks, and again, made all the more incredible by the fact that they were annihilated. That was the newspaper headline in the Daily News: Russia annihilates the U.S. 10-3. So the greatest upset ever as far as I'm concerned, something that will live forever, picked by Sports Illustrated to be the greatest sports moment of the 20th century, which I totally agree with. But again, all these behind the scenes things I found very interesting, and a lot of people just forgot all about them. This is Steve Kallas, speaking of sports. We'll see you the next time.